Hello everybody, welcome to my live Twitter video of Walking on Cinders. Every night at 6 PM I'm reading from my novel, which is 10 years old, or was 10 years old this year, May of 2010 it was published, and so we are now currently on to chapter 24, and you want to listen very carefully this evening because this to me is one of the most significant chapters in the whole of the book. So we are in for a rough ride now with chapter 24. If you've been following so far, you'll totally get it. On the other side of the forest, the United soldiers were making slow progress. Several groups had taken strategic locations which would prove far safer than those on the ground, and the United Army's technical development seemed far and above those of their reformed counterparts. These soldiers had a plan. They had knowledge, but perhaps lacked power. On the other hand, funding and economic problems meant that in certain parts of the world, reformed soldiers often received substandard training. Many soldiers were enlisted from the uneducated lower classes and relied strongly on raw power in their fighting style. Ewan Roberts was positioned towards the back of the field, hidden in a trench with Thomas Fisher, and behind several tall towers which had been erected in the days before the fighting. There was cover on the edge of their area, making it reasonably safe without compromising their various targets. A reformed soldier ran towards them and Ewan shot him fiercely to the ground. Another group followed and dived to the ground as gunfire from the bunker ricocheted off the top of their helmets. But before Ewan and Thomas had a chance to react again, the men had jumped the smallest gap and landed in their trench. There were 5 of them in all, speaking in a language that was unrecognisable to the United men, who merely stood, staring helplessly. Chris was running as fast as his legs would carry him, away from the scene of his crime. The sight that met his eyes on his return to the battlefield worried him greatly. Hundreds of men engaged in hand-to-hand combat across the entire length of the field. Amongst them, he saw several of the reformed suicide bombers. From this angle and position, it appeared that the United men held slightly more ground. He couldn't be sure, but he knew it would be far too dangerous to climb back up the tower that he had once vacated. He remembered his friends were hiding in a bunker towards the back of the field, and so he primed his weapon once again and ran to join them. Chris took a final look down into the distance as he saw the last reformed men approaching fast. There was no turning back now. From here until the end, it was fighting all the way. This was the end of one of the most strategic battles in the entire Third World War, and Chris was ready to play his part. Ewan looked up from the bunker in which he and Thomas were positioned, with 3 United comrades and a group of 5 enemy soldiers talking nervously. He saw Chris approaching from the right flank, running down a clear path from where he could make it into the safety of their trench. What Chris didn't know was that he was heading towards the opposite end of the hideout where, unbeknown to him, a group of nervous reformed soldiers had sought refuge. Chris's boots landed on the damp ground with a thud and he steadied himself against the earth wall of the trench. He looked up and saw 5 reformed soldiers standing in the bunker between him and his friends. As they turned to face him, one of the reformed soldiers fiddled with a small device clipped to his belt. The belt was punctured by a series of rivets, several more resting at different points along its length. Whatever the soldier was trying to do, he appeared to be having great difficulty. Others around him soon moved in to help, shaking nervously as they grouped together, and Chris instinctively raised his weapon in response. It was then that a thought crossed his mind. He could be dealing with some kind of improvised explosive, and all of them could be in deadly trouble. The man with the belt was consciously weighing up the situation, for Chris could see the glazed look in his eyes. If he were carrying improvised devices and they were to be detonated, it would make both him and his comrades glorious martyrs. Within the space of this trench alone, there were many United soldiers, and their courageous sacrifice would be remembered. Chris saw Ewan and Thomas staring at him. They were frozen, well understanding the seriousness of the situation. Around them the battle was going on, the sound of gunfire ringing in their ears, and yet they were oblivious to it all, to everything except this moment as they clung on to life and prayed they might escape death. The armed soldier moved a little away from the rest of his group. Chris could fire at any moment, and on the opposite side of the trench, Ewan and Thomas were armed too. Chris breathed deeply and tried to clear his mind as the man moved backwards to rest his body against the wall of the trench. He closed his eyes. His head was facing towards the battlefield and the fighting that was going on so close to them. His reformed comrades were moving back now, the silence lasting seconds, before the soldier jerked forward suddenly and a low, monotonous ticking signalled the end. 20 seconds, the reformed soldier wheezed, opening his eyes momentarily and speaking for the first time in English. He had a hideous little smile, and when he closed his eyes once more, it became all the more sinister. Then, boom! By the time the man was illustrating his idea with a set of blind hand gestures, all the soldiers, united and reformed, were scrambling up and out of the trench. They reached the top and hit the ground running, not knowing where they were heading. One of the reformed soldiers had fallen behind the rest of the group. There was no hope for him, as the ground behind them exploded into a barrage of mud and dirt. Others died too, thinking perhaps the men were retreating, not running to save their lives. In the panic, Chris, Ewan and Thomas were separated, and not knowing where the others were, each knew that their only choice would be to rejoin the fighting until the bitter end. Those last few moments didn't make much sense to Chris, for his mind was working slower than his body, and he was still thinking about the blast. How had it happened, and how had they managed to escape? The force of the explosion had thrown him to the ground. As he made a conscious decision to look around him, he noticed figures moving in every direction. His ears were full with the continuous dull thud of boots against the wet ground. He had to do something. He had to move. The thought of Commando Babineau rushed through his mind, and he seriously considered playing dead for a while, before realising that he could never live with the shame of being labelled a coward. Slowly and with effort, Chris Aston pulled himself up from the ground and spat the mud from his mouth. His left arm hurt unbearably, and he soon found that he couldn't move it at all. It was perhaps good luck then that he was right-handed and thus still able to hold his gun at an almost direct angle merely from one side. The major remnants of the battle appeared behind him, and the reformed soldiers looked as though they were falling fast. He wondered now how many of these possessed weapons of United design, and he almost wished he could count them in order to gauge the extent of Colonel Smith's deception. But even this was not enough to save the reformed enemy now. Chris subdued the initial threat with 2 shots of his rifle, the electronic aim locking onto the approaching figures. The first, second, and then the third fell in quick succession. Chris knew their crude way of fighting would soon die out, if only through the invention of new technology. Needing cover, Chris's gaze skimmed across the horizon and the length of the field. He spotted what remained of a tarpaulin they had used earlier, stretched over a line of oil drums. If he didn't mind the distraction of the battlefield, he could perhaps reach it. Jumping from space to space across the full width of the field, and by keeping his head down and his body close to the ground, he managed to pass without harassment or attack. Breathing a sigh of release, he slipped under the tarpaulin cover and positioned himself alongside several other United soldiers. Looking out from the space between the barrels, and he arrived just in time to see Private Thomas Fisher running down from the left field of the flank, pursued by a small group of his own comrades towards the very heart of the conflict. Thomas knew that things were getting serious. He knew that this was their only chance. They had been through so much together, all of them, surviving not only the jet crash, but the long and dangerous journey that followed. And they had made friends, great friends, who were thrust into a world which they did not understand. It was not Miss Marmalade's job to look after the injured or the dying, and neither should 2 innocent French teenagers be caught up in such destruction. But it was his job, and he was here to do his duty. For a long time, Thomas had felt inferior. After signing up, he had realised that he was not cut out for the day-to-day trials of training. Chris was a remarkably fitter soldier than he would ever be, and Ewan was showing new promise all the time. But now, as the reformed army was giving it all it had, Thomas knew that he could not let them win. He would not let it happen. The enemy did not realise what would happen if they won. He, on the other hand, was a proud and patriotic Englishman, and he would fight and pay any sacrifice in order to remain free. "Thomas," a tall soldier with dark eyes and a stern look had said when he approached a group of men shortly after the suicide blast, "we need you to lead our final offensive." He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder and directed him to a patch of trees where he was joined by several other United men of various nationalities. He was then introduced to the tactics of their final plan. The enemy were weakening and the end was in sight. These men felt that for their own sanity they must make their way to the very heart of the battle and kill as many of the enemy as was physically possible before exiting into the forest canopy on the opposite side. The idea sounded foolish, but the men remained stocked with a decent supply of ammunition and they looked confident. Thomas was humbled to be asked to join the group, and he immediately accepted their offer. The men wasted no time in taking up positions, 2 lines facing towards the battlefield, where at last the fighting appeared to be dying down. From here it was clear that the United forces greatly outnumbered their reformed rivals, and every now and then there came a crack of bullet fire as it hit against a sheet of metal armour or the outer casing of a heavily fortified artillery vehicle. The order came quickly, and soon they were sprinting head-on towards the reformed soldiers that remained, destroying all who blocked their path. "Fix bayonets!" the tall soldier with the dark eyes shouted as the other men secured their blades to the end of their muzzles. It was an age-old tradition, one which had as much relevance now as ever. "Charge!" shouted Thomas, advancing forwards. He took just enough time to look behind him from the corner of his eye at the tall soldier who had given the initial command. He had not moved, and while the others surged forwards, he remained a safe distance from the enemy. By the time Thomas realised he had been deceived, it was too late. Thomas Fisher watched as soldiers he barely knew aligned alongside him, their feet pounding against the ground. Ahead of them, a group of 5 reformed men turned in the mud, ready to attack. Thomas held his machine gun out before him and fired a round of bullets as the enemy got closer. It made no difference. To the left, 2 united men were standing dangerously close to the barbed wire which marked the edge of the battlefield. An explosion rang out as the men hit landmines, and Thomas dare not look as they were thrown into the air before hitting the ground with a dull thud. But their sacrifice was useful. It caused a series of small explosions up and down the battlefield, each set off like another as a row of falling dominoes. It was a signal for help, and what had, moments before, been a sparse and empty battlefield was soon filled again with soldiers who had been taking refuge in trenches or under cover. Running to escape the falling shrapnel, many took charge of the armoured artillery vehicles whose drivers had earlier been killed. As the men rushed forwards, those who had been fighting alongside Thomas disappeared into the crowd, leaving him alone. His keen eye for danger was set on the enemy, and yet he was a single soldier pitted against 5 men who were probably far stronger and faster than he was. Turning his head, he looked around helplessly for Ewan or Chris or anyone that he recognised. Soon a patch of open ground formed around the small group, and, taking a gulp, Thomas Fisher made his final decision. Running forwards, he pushed through the men who had raised their guns on either side. There was a strange bewilderment amongst these soldiers now, for so few reformed men remained that it was almost safe to stand alone on the battlefield. They could not help it. There was nothing they could do but stare as Thomas headed ever forwards. It was only when the two sides met that they were drawn from their stupor and rallied on their comrade, firing left and right to try and conceal his attack. A rogue bullet pierced Thomas's boot, and he reeled back in pain. It was unbearable. Inside his mind, he wanted to give up. Nevertheless, he had to keep on, with one final task left to complete. Dragging his injured foot behind him, he moved forwards, primed his weapon, and fired at the nearest reformed soldier, sending him flailing to the ground and provoking a barrage of bullets from soldiers on both sides. The gap between them was quickly swallowed up as the men rounded to fight against each other on the two sides, ally against enemy, good against evil. And this was how Thomas Fisher found himself at the front of the group, injured and aware of a pain he had never before experienced. With no path of retreat or any substantial protection, he primed his gun one more time, but it was just too late. Everything from the hail of bullet fire and the voice to the shrapnel from those exploding landmines froze for a split second. Then, in slow motion, Private Thomas Fisher fell forwards and gripped his chest. He had no idea who had fired the bullet, but he felt the thump as he hit the ground, and he noticed his vision blur. There would be no more pain, no more killing, and no time to say goodbye. So that is chapter 24 of my novel, Walking on Cinders. We'll carry on this story, we'll pick it up exactly there tomorrow evening at 6 p.m, chapter 25. I really hope you can join me then.